All right, so you know those articles you sent over about the new right in foreign policy?
Yeah.
Let's dive into that
Sure.
because I think there's a lot there and it's something that we hear about a lot,
Yeah.
but I feel like we haven't really fully grasped the nuances of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting stuff, and it's something that's kind of going beyond just Trump,
Right.
which is, I think, what makes it really fascinating. It's more of like an ideological shift.
Yeah. It seems like it's something that has more staying power than just,
Right.
the personality.
Yeah, and it seems like it's going to be with us for a while, and it's really challenging.
Yeah.
Kind of the old fusionism that
Yeah.
defined conservatism
Okay.
for a while, and they're really going after the foreign policy establishment in D.C.
So this is serious. This isn't just like a passing political wave.
No, they're thinking long term. They're trying to, change think tanks, media, and
Wow.
staff a potential future Republican administration.
Okay, so they're playing the long game here, but when we say the new,
Right.
right, it's not like a monolithic block, is it?
No, not at all.
How do we understand the different factions within the new?
Right. So there are a lot of different labels, and it can be confusing.
Yes.
The article that you sent by Stefan Borg, I think, does a really good job of breaking it down.
Okay.
He highlights 3 main groups, and I think those are really the ones to focus on.
All right.
So first you have the Claremonters,
Right.
who are often seen as kind of like the intellectual core,
Okay, so these are like the thinkers,
Yeah.
the writers?
the academics,
Okay.
and they really promote American exceptionalism. Okay.
And they want to promote a realist foreign policy.
So are they less idealistic than about America's role in the world than previous conservatives?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
They want to avoid these kind of unnecessary entanglements,
Okay.
and they want to focus on core national interests.
Okay.
They're also very skeptical of immigration and globalism,
Right.
and they advocate for a more restrained approach overall.
So how does that play out? Like, what's an example of that more restrained approach?
Well, you can look at military intervention.
Okay.
So traditional conservatives might support intervention to promote democracy around the world,
Right.
but the Claremonters are much more likely to argue that
Okay.
the costs outweigh the benefits,
Okay.
and that the U.S. should be more careful about using military force. So be more judicious in how they use American power.
Exactly.
Okay, so less gung-ho about,
Yeah.
spreading democracy through military means.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And then the second group that he talks about, the post-liberals.
Yes.
Now they seem like kind of a curveball in this whole new...
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are an interesting group, and they've become really disillusioned with liberalism.
Both domestically and international.
Both.
Okay.
So they see it as a failed project,
Yep.
and they want to move beyond it. And so, interestingly, they also advocate for a restrained foreign policy,
Okay.
but with an emphasis on cooperation and what they call cultural non-aggression.
So less about kind of imposing Western values on the rest of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
More about finding common ground based on shared interests.
How does that work in practice, though? Like, if you think about a country like China,
Yeah, that's a great question.
what does a post-liberal foreign policy look like toward China?
So unlike some of the more hawkish factions of the new, right,
Yeah.
the post-liberals tend to view China as a civilizational equal.
Okay, so not an enemy.
Right. They would say that the enemy is kind of like the liberal international order
Okay,
that created China in a way.
interesting.
So they're critical of this antagonistic approach to China, and they think that the U.S. should focus on peaceful coexistence.
Okay, so cooperation where possible,
Yeah.
trying to find common ground with China.
And I think Patrick Deneen is a good example of this.
Okay.
He's a prominent post-liberal thinker,
Okay.
and he argues that the U.S. needs to focus more on national sovereignty
Right.
and self-sufficiency.
So a more hands-off approach.
Yeah, less involvement in the world, less globalization.
Okay, so that's a pretty big departure from how both Democrats and Republicans have traditionally approached China.
Yeah, it is.
And then finally, there's this group, the National Conservatives,
Right.
or the natcons.
Yeah, cons, right.
And this is who Borg seems to argue are kind of the ones to watch.
Yeah.
Like, they might be on track for a takeover of the right's foreign policy vision.
They seem to be ascendant right now.
So what makes them stand out from the other two groups?
So like the Claremonters, they really champion national interests,
Okay.
and they're skeptical of globalization.
Okay.
But where they differ is on China.
Okay.
So they're still in favor of restraint in general.
Okay.
But when it comes to China, they're actually quite hawkish.
So that's interesting because it seems like a bit of a contradiction.
Right.
They want to avoid the mistakes of the past,
Yeah.
like the Iraq War,
Like these forever wars.
Right.
Yeah.
But they're also willing to project power against China.
Yes.
So how do they square that circle?
Yeah, so that's something that Borg really hones in on in this article.
Okay.
And I think it's a central dilemma
Yeah.
that the new right is grappling with. It's a tough one, right? Because on the one hand, they want to learn from the failures of Iraq.
Right.
They don't want to get bogged down in these forever wars.
No more global policemen.
Exactly.
But at the same time, they see China
Right.
and they say, okay, we need to be willing to project power.
Yeah.
So it's like they're trying to redefine
Right.
what American power looks like
Yeah.
in the 21st century.
And what it means to be a global power.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And so it's sort of like targeted power.
Right.
Strategic
engagement.
engagement.
Not just like we're everywhere doing everything.
Not reacting to every single crisis.
Right.
But really thinking, okay, where are our vital interests?
Yeah. Where do we need to be involved?
But how do we do it?
Okay, so how do these different factions,
Yeah.
because we've got these 3 different groups within the new,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
How are they actually operationalizing this vision?
That's a great question.
Because it's one thing to write about it,
Right.
sit in your armchair.
Chair strategizing. Exactly.
But it's another thing to actually be in the room making those decisions.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting because Borg, he points to the growing influence of the new right in places like think tanks,
Oh, interesting.
which often serve as pipelines to government positions.
Okay.
So he specifically mentions the Heritage Foundation
Okay.
and their Project 2025,
Okay.
which is basically a blueprint for how to staff a future Republican administration
Wow.
with people who are aligned with this new right vision.
So they're not just trying to influence the conversation.
Right.
They're trying to get their people in the door.
They want to be the ones making the decisions.
Making the decisions.
Yeah, and so this potential natcon takeover,
Okay.
as Borg puts it, is already having an impact.
Really?
And we can see this in the debate over aid to Ukraine.
Okay.
So the Heritage Foundation, for instance, has been very skeptical
Hmm.
of continued aid to Ukraine.
More so than maybe some other conservative groups.
Much more so.
Interesting.
They see it as a distraction from China.
Which fits in with their whole...
Exactly, Asia first approach.
Right.
Rich.
So figures like Kevin Roberts,
Okay.
who's the president of Heritage,
Okay.
he's argued that, we need to be focusing on China.
Okay.
This is the main threat.
Right.
And that getting bogged down in Ukraine is only going to help China in the long run.
So that's really interesting because it's a departure from
Okay.
how Republicans have traditionally viewed
Right.
Russia, right? Which has been
Much more hawkish on Russia.
more hawkish, right?
Yeah.
So they're saying, no, China's the bigger threat,
China's the long-term threat.
long-term strategic threat.
Mhm.
We need to be focusing our energy and attention there. Exactly.
Okay, so then what are the consequences of that?
Yeah.
Because that seems like a pretty significant...
It's a huge shift.
Yes.
Right. So if a future administration
Yeah.
adopts this Asia first approach,
What does that look like?
well, on the one hand,
Yeah.
focusing on the Indo-Pacific
Okay.
makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
China's a rising power.
Right.
Their military is getting stronger.
Yeah.
Their economy is growing.
They're expanding their influence.
So the U.S. needs to be prepared to compete with that.
Okay, but what happens to
Yeah.
Europe?
Right. What happens to our allies in Europe?
Our allies in the Middle East?
Exactly.
If we're pulling back
As we're shifting
the
resources.
Pacific,
Yeah. And that's a huge question.
because are we going to see Russia emboldened?
Right. Is this going to undermine NATO?
Yeah.
These are questions that
Big questions, yeah.
we don't really have the answers to.
And then beyond that, what does it say to our allies around the world
Exactly.
if they see us
Are we a reliable partner?
pulling back from certain commitments?
Are we going to be there for them?
Right? Are we going to honor our commitments?
Right. Because this gets to the whole question of credibility.
Credibility and reputation.
Right.
Right. So how does...
Because if we're not there,
Yeah,
who's going to fill that vacuum?
exactly. And will it be actors that share our values?
Exactly.
Probably not.
Probably not.
Right. So that's a big risk.
Yeah. So it's a tough dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you could say, look, the U.S. can't be everything to everyone.
Right. We can't police the world.
We can't be the world's policeman.
Yeah. And we've overextended ourselves in the past.
Right.
So maybe it's time to kind of pull back.
Become more strategic.
Be more strategic. Prioritize.
Right.
But then the question is, does that make the world more dangerous?
Yeah.
Do we end up creating more problems?
More problems than we solve.
Exactly. And that's the tension that Borg highlights, I think, in this article.
It's like a really tough needle to thread.
It is.
Because you want to be,
Yeah.
humble about what American power can achieve.
Right. And I think that's something that the new right really emphasizes.
Yeah.
This idea of restraint.
Okay.
Not trying to do too
Not trying to solve every problem.
not trying to impose our will on the world.
Right.
But at the same time, we live in a messy world.
Yeah.
And American power does matter. It does.
So it's finding that balance.
Right. So less about isolationism and more about just being really deliberate.
Yeah, a more selective approach.
And strategic about how we engage.
Yeah, where do we get involved?
Right.
How do we get involved?
What are the tools that we use?
Exactly. What are our interests?
Because it's not like where the world's going to, magically become peaceful if we just bring all of our troops home.
Right.
So I think for our listeners, we can get really deep in the weeds on this stuff.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean?
Right.
Like on a practical level, if this new right vision for foreign policy becomes reality?
Yeah. How does America's role in the world change?
How does it actually look different?
Well, I think one of the biggest changes would be a real emphasis on the Indo-Pacific. So we would see increased military spending in that region.
Okay.
Stronger alliances with countries like Japan, Australia, India.
So a real pivot away from Europe.
Potentially, and I think that's the big question mark.
Which is a huge shift.
It's a huge shift, and it's something that a lot of people are worried about.
Because, what does that mean for NATO?
Right. What does that mean for our commitment to Europe?
Does Russia just get a free pass?
Exactly. And then beyond the immediate security concerns,
right,
there's the whole question of America's reputation.
Right. Do people still trust us?
Right. Are we still seen as a reliable partner?
Yeah.
And if not,
right,
what are the consequences of that?
Yeah. I think that's the big question that Borg leaves us with is this idea that restraint might be the right approach.
Right.
But it could also backfire.
It could make the world more dangerous.
In ways that are hard to predict.
Exactly. So it's a gamble.
It is a gamble.
And it's one that...
It's not a theoretical debate anymore.
No, it's happening right now.
We see it in the way that...
With Ukraine.
We're thinking about Ukraine.
With China.
With China, with everything.
Yeah.
This is the debate that's happening right now.
And I think the 2024 election is going to be really decisive in terms of what direction we go in.
Yeah, which path we choose.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, this was great.
I feel like we could go on for another hour.
I know there's so much more to say.
There's so much more to say, but we're going to have to leave it there for now.
Okay.
But to our listeners, I hope this has been helpful in kind of getting a handle on this new... Right.
These really complicated debates.
Because these are the debates that are shaping the future of American foreign policy.
They really are.
And, it's important to understand them.
It is.
Even if you don't agree with everything that you hear.
Absolutely.
So thank you for coming on and diving into this with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week with another deep dive.